Welcome to our deep dive into the cases Tim Bleefnick.
Oh.
We're going to be unraveling a really perplexing murder mystery from Quincy, Illinois.
Yeah.
And Quincy is a town where violent crime is like as rare as a blizzard in July.
Yeah. And what makes this case so fascinating is that it starts with this seemingly picture-perfect family, Tim and Becky Bleefnick. They built a life in Quincy, had 3 wonderful boys, and to the outside world, things looked pretty idyllic. But behind the facade, a storm was brewing.
So rewind back to 2019. Tim appears on Family Feud with his family. Seems like a fun, lighthearted moment.
Right.
Except, when asked about his biggest wedding regret, Tim jokes, "Honey, I love you, but Tessie do." And little did anyone know that this seemingly innocent comment would become a focal point just a few years later.
It's incredible how, like, a throwaway remark can take on such significance in hindsight. At the time, no one could have predicted the tragedy that was about to unfold, and the prosecution never even brought it up during the trial. But for those following the case, that Family Feud clip became this eerie foreshadowing of the troubled marriage that was about to implode.
So fast forward a couple of years, cracks are starting to show in the Bleefnick marriage. Becky goes back to school to become a nurse and things get tense. Tim claims she became stressed and impatient, while Becky's family and friends described him as controlling and manipulative.
This difference in perspective is a common thread throughout the entire case. You have Tim's narrative and then the narrative of Becky's loved ones. And they paint 2 drastically different pictures of the marriage.
And then in 2021, Tim files for divorce. That's when things really hit the fan.
The divorce was incredibly contentious. They fought over finances, house, and most importantly, custody of their children. These disputes created a powder keg of resentment and animosity.
Amidst all of this, Becky confides in her friends and family, expressing her fear of Tim. She even sends a chilling text to her sister saying, "If something ever happens to me, make sure the #1 person of interest is Tim." It's like she sensed something terrible was coming.
It's a haunting premonition, and both Tim and Becky even filed orders of protection against each other, each claiming harassment. Neither was granted, but a judge did order Tim to return a 9mm handgun that Becky had given him as a gift.
And that detail, of course, becomes incredibly significant because Becky is later found shot to death in her bathroom with a 9mm weapon.
Exactly. But it's important to note that despite Becky's fear, there's no evidence of physical abuse during the marriage. No police reports were ever filed, and there are no documented injuries. So the question becomes, was Becky's fear justified, or was Tim being unfairly painted as a villain?
Right. Because her fear, while real, doesn't automatically translate to proof of Kim's guilt. So let's talk about the night of the murder. Becky is home alone. Her sons are staying with Kim. Later that day, her father discovers her body. She'd been shot 14 times.
It was a brutal scene. And as the investigation kicks off, police start uncovering clues. A partial shoe print, spent 9mm shell casings, and strangely enough, shreds of plastic from an ALDI grocery bag. These seemingly insignificant details will eventually become key pieces of the puzzle.
And then there's that grainy surveillance footage.
Yeah.
It shows a person on a bike near Becky's house right before and after the murder, but it's impossible to make out who it is.
The footage is frustratingly inconclusive, but it adds this extra layer of mystery. Is it Tim on the bike? Is it someone else entirely? The footage doesn't give us any definitive answers.
So you have these initial clues, but investigators need something more concrete to connect Tim to the crime, and that's where the digital trail comes into play.
This is where things get really interesting. Remember that bike from the surveillance footage? It was a blue Schwinn, no reflectors. Well, police find a bike matching that description not far from Tim's house.
Okay, but Quincy's a small town. Couldn't it just be a coincidence?
That's what the defense argued. But then investigators uncovered something much more damning. Tim had a secret Facebook account, a burner account under a fake name, and he'd been using it to search for a bike, just like the one seen near the crime scene.
Wow, a secret Facebook account. That definitely doesn't look good.
Not at all. And the digital trail gets even deeper. When they analyzed Tim's phone, they found searches for things like how to open my door with a crowbar, how to make a homemade pistol silencer, and most chillingly, how to clean gunpowder off your hands.
Those searches are incredibly suspicious, especially in light of everything else that's going on. It really makes you wonder what was going through Tim's mind in the days and weeks leading up to Becky's death.
It does raise some serious questions, and there's another layer to this digital trail that points to a potential motive. Tim's phone records showed over 200 searches for the license plate and VIN number of a man Becky was dating. These searches were made shortly after that man's trunk was spotted in Becky's driveway.
So it seems like jealousy could have been a factor, but at this point, it's all still circumstantial evidence.
Yeah, exactly. There's no smoking gun, no eyewitness placing Tim at the scene of the crime. But the prosecution believed they had enough to build a strong case, and they moved quickly. The trial started just 3 months after Becky's death.
That's incredibly fast. Didn't Tim have the right to a trial within 6 months in Illinois?
He did. Tim and his lawyers wanted a speedy trial. Most defendants would try to delay the trial for as long as possible to give their lawyers more time to prepare. But for whatever reason, Tim's team decided to go to trial right away.
That's a bold move, especially considering they were facing a mountain of circumstantial evidence. So how did the trial play out?
The prosecution laid out their case methodically. They presented the ALDI bag shreds found at the crime scene and argued that Tim had fired the gun through a similar bag. This was key because they found his DNA on those plastic shreds.
That seems like a pretty crucial piece of evidence. Did the defense challenge this at all?
They did. They tried to poke holes in the DNA evidence, suggesting it could have been transferred through some other means. But the prosecution also had another powerful piece of evidence, those shell casings. Remember the 9mm shell casings found at Tim's house? Ballistics experts matched 27 of them to the ones found at the crime scene, proving they were fired from the same gun.
Okay, so they've got the DNA on the bag, the matching shell casings. That's starting to sound like a pretty solid case. What else did the prosecution present?
One of the more intriguing pieces of evidence was Tim's fitness tracker data. It tracked his activity every second of the day, and it showed gaps in activity around the time the suspicious figure was seen on camera near Becky's house.
Ah, so the prosecution was trying to use his own fitness tracker against him, suggesting he was active during the time of the murder, but that he had somehow tampered with the data to conceal his movements.
Exactly, but the defense had a counter-argument for everything. They emphasized that there was no murder weapon, found no bloody clothing, and no DNA evidence linking Tim directly to the crime scene. They also attacked the reliability of the surveillance footage, arguing that it was too grainy to make any positive identification.
So it sounds like the defense was really trying to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury, but they didn't call any witnesses of their own.
Nope. They presented no witnesses, no alibi, no alternative theories. Their entire strategy hinged on discrediting the prosecution's case and hoping that would be enough to sway the jury.
That's a huge gamble.
Yeah.
So what was the atmosphere like in the courtroom during all this? It must have been incredibly tense, especially for Becky's family.
You could feel the weight of the situation, the tragedy that had affected everyone involved. Becky's family and friends were there every day hoping for justice, and Tim's family was present too, supporting him despite the mounting evidence against him.
And then after a 6-day trial, it was time for the jury to deliberate.
Those deliberations lasted for hours. There were reports of heated discussions, disagreements, even a holdout juror who wasn't convinced of Tim's guilt.
Wow, so it sounds like it wasn't a clear-cut decision.
Not at all. This was a case built entirely on circumstantial evidence. There was no direct proof, no eyewitness, no confession. It all came down to whether the jury believed the prosecution had woven together a strong enough narrative to prove Tim's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
So after all of that, what was the verdict?
After 4 long hours, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. Tim Bleefnick was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
That's a heavy outcome. A life sentence with no chance of ever getting out. How did everyone react when the verdict was read?
Becky's family was overcome with emotion. It was a mix of relief, sadness, and exhaustion. It was a bittersweet victory they got justice for Becky, but the pain of her loss would be with them forever. As for Tim, he remained stoic, maintaining his innocence.
And years later, he still claims he's innocent, right?
He does. Tim is currently appealing the verdict. His lawyers are arguing that the prosecution's case was flawed, that the evidence was circumstantial, and that there wasn't enough to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
It really makes you think about the burden of proof in a case like this. Even with all of the evidence the prosecution presented, the digital trail, the shell casings, the ALDI bag, it still comes down to the jury's interpretation of that evidence.
Absolutely, and that's what makes the justice system so complex. It's not always about finding definitive proof. It's about weighing the evidence, considering all possible explanations, and ultimately deciding whether the prosecution has met that burden of proof.
So where do things stand now with Tim's appeal?
It's still ongoing. Appeals can take years to work their way through the court system, and there's no guarantee that Tim's appeal will be successful. But regardless of the outcome, this case has left an undeniable mark on the Quincy community.
It's a story that reminds us that even in the most seemingly peaceful places, darkness can lurk beneath the surface.
And it also highlights the complexities of domestic disputes, the devastating impact of violence, and the challenges of seeking justice when the truth is often shrouded in ambiguity.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive. A seemingly perfect family torn apart, a contentious divorce, a chilling murder, and a trial that gripped the nation. This case had it all. From the haunting premonition in Becky's text message to the shocking discovery of Kim's secret Facebook account.
It's a case that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, the limits of our justice system, and the enduring power of doubt. Even with a guilty verdict, there are still so many unanswered questions. Did Tim act alone? What was going through his mind in those final days and weeks leading up to Becky's death?
As you continue to ponder those questions, we encourage you to explore the additional resources provided with this deep dive. This case is a stark reminder that every story has multiple sides, and the pursuit of truth is rarely straightforward.